Welcome to Bigfoot Society. If you have Bigfoot activity to report from the same areas discussed in this episode, please reach out to me directly after this episode. And if you'd like to be on the podcast to discuss a personal Bigfoot encounter, please reach out to me directly at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Do you wish there was more Bigfoot Society to listen to every week? Well, there is now. If you become a supporting member over at Patreon, you get a special members-only episode every single week on Wednesdays, and sometimes even more episodes. Head on over to patreon.com/The Bigfoot Society. And now let's get on with the show. All right, Bigfoot Society, we got the privilege of talking to Brad today. He's a listener from Oregon that reached out with some really interesting things that he's experienced over the years. Brad, I'm so glad you reached out, and I'm excited to talk to you tonight. How's it going, man?
Great, Jeremiah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome. We talked a little bit in the pre-interview, and this is going to get pretty interesting. There's even some Oak Ridge, Oregon related stuff that coming up. But Brad, I'm going to give it right over to you, and we'll get right into it tonight.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeremiah. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and I was an outdoorsy kind of kid. My grandparents lived on the McKenzie River up near the town of Vida, and I spent all my childhood free time up there roaming the woods and the creeks and the hillsides. And grandparents are a little looser than the parents are about where the kid is. So I had free range in the mountains. I never really thought about Sasquatch or Bigfoot at all growing up, and never really had anything happen to me that would make me think that there were any Bigfoot around. But until I was about, let's see, how old was I? I was probably around 14 years old, 15 years old. My grandma would drive me up these old logging roads with my bow, and I would hunt these logging roads on my way and just wander my way back to her house down these logging roads. And there was a time she dropped me off, and it's about a 3 or 4 mile walk back down to her house. And I was let out of the car, and the birds were chirping and the squirrels were chattering at me. And I would usually sit in a little burrow ditch and wait for her car till I couldn't hear her car anymore. And then I start walking down the logging road, and never really planned on shooting a deer with a bow. It was more of just me being out in the woods. But anyway, I heard her car disappear out of range, out of my hearing. And all of a sudden I just had this very strange sensation of it's like if the forest just went silent, and I just got a really weird feeling. So I'm standing on the logging road, looking down into the ravine below me, and these 3 deer come creeping up out of the ravine, really low, really a strange movement, hunkered down and almost trying to crawl. And they were covered in sweat, totally lathered over, and their eyes were bulging out of their heads, and they walked I could have reached out and touched one with my arrow. They were so close, and they could have cared less that I was there. I thought that was really weird. And so I'm looking down into the ravine where they came from, and a tree, it's just got cracked in half and was pushed over. And there was no wind. There was no reason for it to happen. It sounded like a healthy, live green fir tree just snapped in half. And that was the first encounter. But again, in the 80s, Bigfoot was definitely not on my mind. I just thought it was strange, and wandered on back to my grandma's house. And then let's see, there was another time. I'm going to back up to when I was a little younger.
Before you do that, so I just want to clarify something. So when you were looking down the ravine, you heard that tree get cracked in half and pushed over.
Yeah, a deer had walked by me, and I couldn't figure out why they were, because I'd never seen deer behave like that. It was almost like they were creeping past me and their eyes were bulged out, and they looked, if you see a horse that's been run too hard, they just had this sheen they looked terrified. And then this tree just goes crack and goes crashing down to the ground. And a green, not punky, just a green, big fir tree. It sounded like a mature tree. And it didn't freak me out, but I just was odd. And so I didn't hightail it. I just moseyed back to my grandma's house.
When you were out in the woods with your bow, did you ever hear any sounds out there that didn't fit with what should be out in the wood?
The only times I ever did are the stories I'm going to tell you. Other than that,
Okay.
never, which is, it's strange. It never crossed my mind. No signs or never even crossed my mind. I'll back up a little bit. I skipped this one. This happened when I was 10 years old on Lost Creek Campground. It's on the west side of Mount Hood in 1980. And I know the date exactly because the day after this event happened, Mount St. Helens erupted. So it was May 1980. It's when this happened. And I was camping with a family friend for the weekend. And again, I completely forgot about this until I heard somebody tell a similar story. And it's funny how these things come back to you when you hear something that just sparked this memory. And we were camping at this campground, and it was you pull your trailer in, and it was a pretty crowded campground. And there we had a camper, there's a tent, there's a table set up, there was a fire pit. So it was a cramped little space. And it's night, and my friend and I are sleeping in the tent, and his parents are sleeping in the camper. And I'm laying there in bed. I don't know what time it was, between 10 and midnight, probably, because I wasn't asleep yet. And I heard what sounded like a deer bounding through the camp, bounding, and then it stopped right outside our tent. And we had a little cord that was holding the vestibule. We had it tied around a tree. And I kept hearing this thump. It was twanging the cord. And I thought, oh, a deer must have jumped the cord or tripped into the cord or something. And then it thumped away. But what was weird is a few minutes later, thump came back, and it did the same thing. It was twanging the little cord that was holding the vestibule of the tent up, probably 2 or 3 twangs like a guitar string. And then it thumped away through camp. And that was it. So I wake up in the morning, I was like, gosh, did you guys hear that deer in camp last night? And they didn't hear anything. But then I started thinking, there's no way a deer could have run through the camp because there's coolers and there's stuff everywhere. Besides, it was flicking it would thump up to the tent, stop, and then the little cord would go boing, boing, and vibrate the tent. So that happened. It did that 2 times. And then the next morning, we forgot all about it because Mount St. Helens had erupted while we were having breakfast, and you could hear the sonic boom, and the ground shook, and we all knew what it was because, everyone in the Northwest was waiting for it to happen. So that sort of trumped whatever happened to me that night, that was pretty cool. And then there was ash all over our cars the next day. It was cool. Let's see. I've got I'll talk a little bit more about what happened upon the McKenzie River where I grew up. So let's see. This is a weird one. So the year was, I wrote all this stuff down. I was a junior in high school. And my grandma was a really cool old lady, and all my high school friends would come up there and spend the night. She'd cook for us, and we'd fish and run around the forest and play in the yard. And she had about 13 acres. And one night we were out playing a game called Kick the Can, which is like a hide and seek game where you put a can in the middle of the field, and one person guards it. If someone gets tagged and you kick the can, the person who you tagged goes free. So we're all out there, probably 8 of us, out playing this game, and I'm hiding in some ferns, and all of a sudden, a couple of the people who were there's 2 people who were they're out in the field, and they stop, and they are just staring up at the mountainside that's next to the property. And pretty soon, all the rest of the kids come out, and they're all looking up in the sky. I'm like, what the heck's going on? So I get out of my hiding spot, and I join them in the field, and I look up, and there are 3 bluish green, I think they were bluish green balls of light, about the size of beach balls, big kind of rubber beach balls you would see at like a music festival or something. And so if I'm looking It's straight across the property to the hillside is 12 o'clock. There was one at about 9 o'clock that was maybe 300 or 400 yards away, not on our property, but to the next piece of property in the above the forest there. There was one probably 10 o'clock that was right above where this creek runs down into our property. And then there was one at about 1 o'clock. And they were just green orb-ish balls just hovering in the sky. And we're all like, whoa, what's going on? What's that? We didn't know what they were. And the Rolodex starts going over in your mind. Is it a weather balloon? What is it? And then it was none of that. It was just these balls of light. And at the same time, so they were just stationary in the sky above the fir trees. And there were different elevations. So one was down on across from us, flat, probably 20 feet above the fir trees there. And the other one was another up the hillside. They were all the same distance above the fir trees, if that makes sense. And all of a sudden, at the very same time, they started descending into the trees, into the fir trees. And you could see all the boughs of the fir trees lighting up around them. And they just slowly went into the forest at the same time. It was really weird. And we freaked out and all went back inside and called it a night. So that was strange. So the next day, so this is at the end of September, most of the kids left that next day, and my buddy and I were going to go grouse hunting. We stayed. So we're like, oh, let's go grouse hunting. And so there's an old logging road straight across from my grandma's place. And so we'd always hunt this logging road, and we'd hike a couple miles up, and there was this really neat kind of, we're hunting in, I'd say it's second growth. So the trees are probably 60 or 70 years old and pretty mature forest. But there was a really cool spot that the loggers had left that they didn't cut. It was maybe 8 or 9 acres with really beautiful old growth. And so we'd go hike to that spot, we'd always leave our guns outside. We never took anything in there, any guns or weapons, just because it felt like a sort of a sacred place. It was really amazing. So we'd go and sit and visit, and then we'd hunt back down the road to my grandma's house. And there was so between this neat little old growth section and her house was a giant, one of those big giant, those power lines that go across the state, those giant high tension power lines. And a little service road ran under it. And we'd go to the little old growth spot, come down, and then turn down the little service road underneath the high tension power lines and eat a sandwich and drink something, because it was in the sun. Because when you're on these logging roads and these big trees, it's like a tunnel and there's no direct sunlight. So we'd always go and get a little sunshine on our faces and have a sandwich and just sit and look out across the mountains. So we'd done that. We were on our way back down, and this is where it gets pretty weird. And so let me see. So we're walking down the road, and we're about to turn right to go down this little service road, logging road, to eat our sandwiches. And from our right side, probably 20 yards just off the edge of the logging road in the forest, we hear 2 whoops. Whoop, whoop, really loud. And before we can really acknowledge what we just heard, we both just stopped and freeze, and this wave of unbelievable fear that I can't really describe came over us. It was like we walked into an invisible sort of bowl of jelly. I couldn't move, and neither could my friend. And the fear was, I can't describe the fear. It's just, unless it's happened to you, I think it's hard to explain. So the whoops happen, and then across the little service road, the forest continues, but the face of this forest it gets a lot of sunlight. So it was Scotch broom, blackberries, so you couldn't really see into the little thicket of trees that was on the other side. And from that side, all of a sudden, and we're frozen and we can't move, and all of a sudden I hear the sound. And I've gone online and listened to certain animals as I've heard people's accounts. And it sounded exactly like, if you listen to what an alligator or crocodile sounds like, they vibrate. I don't think they have vocal cords, but they make this weird vibrating noise. It sounded exactly like that at first, where just my eyes are bulging out of my head, and the noise is just, it's reverberating through this whole little landing that we're standing in. We can kind of, at this point, I'm sort of like, oh gosh, starting to maybe pivot around a little bit, and my senses are coming back, and we're talking back and forth like, what the heck's going on? And as we start to talk, that sound, and it's inhaling, and it's this raspy inhale and just vibrating out this noise. It sounds like an alligator. And then it goes from that sound to, and again, I've found these sounds online. It sounded like, if you ever listen to a lion while it eats, like a big male lion eating, kind of purrs and growls at the same time. So it would inhale, you could hear it inhaling this really raspy noise. And then when it would exhale, it would make this sort of purring growl like a lion. But it was really loud. And all I could think of was, that thing's got to be the size of a rhinoceros, whatever's in there. And it was doing that. It would inhale and then exhale this purring, strange growl. And we're starting to freak out a little bit, obviously. And we're thinking to ourselves, what in the heck? We're going, not a deer, not an elk, not a cougar, not a bear, and not a person in there trying to mess with us. But again, I'm not thinking Bigfoot at all, which is weird, because growing up in Oregon, you hear about Bigfoot, but it just wasn't entering my mind. So we're standing there, and I'd forgotten we even have guns because we're just so scared. So as we start to shift our bodies, this is maybe a minute or two has gone by since we heard those initial whoops. So it's going by pretty quick, and my mind's just racing, trying to figure out what's happening. If we start to talk, what are we going to do? How are we going to get, because we have to walk underneath because the road cuts down below where this is happening in this little thicket of trees. And the trees are probably, it's a newer grove of fir trees, and the trees were probably 30, 40 feet tall. But you couldn't see, like I said, you couldn't really see in. So we're like, oh shoot, how are we going to get out of here? Because that thing is, whatever that thing is, it's mad. So as we're shifting and we're starting to talk about what we're going to do, I'm like, we each have a 12-gauge shotgun. We could fire over the trees, wait for it to run off, and then boogie out of there. And the minute I started with my gun to consider lifting it up and firing it, the place erupted. It went from this weird purring growl to just this screaming roar of, I can't describe it. It was just blowing through our body, blowing through our bodies. And the trees started to shake, and there was branches starting to snap. And I remember seeing two trees that were probably 35 or 40 feet tall next to each other, just shaking violently back and forth. I'm like, gosh, what in the heck can be doing that? And then they went from back and forth to front and back, completely different directions at the same time, like something was grabbing them with their hands and just shaking them back and forth. And so we're terrified, and we don't know what to do. I think I'm crying at this point, and just the fear, just poof, overwhelmed. So screw it, we got to get out of here. So we both agree we're going to shoot over this thing, over the trees, and then bolt underneath it. Hopefully the sound of our guns will scare it off. So yeah, we fire over the treetops, and we wait a second to see if we can hear whatever's in there take off. It didn't. It just, what we thought was pretty much max, it just elevated even worse, and it was screaming and making those crazy sounds. And so we, heck with it, we got to go. So we bolted. And if you hiked on logging roads, you know that the rocks, it's not small little gravel, they're big rocks, and it's hard to keep your balance. And so I'm thinking the whole time is I'm going to wipe out, and this thing's going to jump down and grab me, because I'm running as fast as I've ever ran before. My heels were hitting my butt, and I got a shotgun and like hiking boots on, and I'm we're hauling down this road, and as I'm running underneath, as we're running underneath where this thing is, I'm just thinking this thing's going to grab me. I'm dead. We're going to die. But for some reason, it never did. But the hair on my neck, I could just feel it above me. I never saw it, but I could just tell that there was, and it was huffing. And at this point, it had stopped all the ruckus and was just up there huffing and breathing really loudly. And I could just feel, as I ran underneath this thing, feel it above me. And I just thought it was going to reach down and grab me, but it never did. And so booked it to my grandma's house, which we had to cross a road, and down her driveway is probably 100 yards long to where her house was. And so we make it to the front yard, and she's out in the yard. She must have heard the shots. And so she's out there. What's wrong? What's going on? I heard shots. And she's a tough old lady. And we told her what happened, and we're crying and we're freaked out. And she looked at us and says, "You ran into a Bigfoot." And we looked at each other and like, what? For some reason, it's just still not sinking in. That's what it was. And we're like, what do you mean we ran into a Bigfoot? And she says, well, there's a pizza joint that's down the road on the highway from her house that her and her friend would go to every Friday night and have a glass of wine and eat pizza. And she was telling me that, or told us that when she would go, her and her friend Ellen would go and have pizza and drink wine, the loggers it was a loggers hangout back in the 80s. When the logging industry was a very different back then. It was smaller operations and families and things. It was a lot different than it is now. But that's where all the loggers would go and on Friday night and hang out. And she said that she'd overhear the loggers talk about things like this happening to them in the forest. She said, I would hear story after story of these sort of things happening and hear them from these loggers who are out there doing it, logging, and they're in the forest every day. That's it. So the next day, and it didn't really affect me the way I hear people talk about getting terrified of going back in the woods. It was like it was erased from my mind. So the next day, I'm up there, and my friend had to leave, had to go back to Eugene. And so I stayed, and I said, Grandma, I'm going to go and back up to where that happened and look around and see what I can see. Because I'm still thinking, for whatever reason, I couldn't get it into my head that it was a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I'm going to go look for hoof tracks. I'm going to go look for claw marks in the tree, because that's what I thought it was for some reason. I go up there, and it's not very far away. It's probably less than a quarter of a mile from her house up this road, the logging road. So I go into this thicket where this had happened, and I knew nothing about Bigfoot tracks or what to look for in that regard. I'm just looking for hoof prints. I'm looking for scrapes from antlers, and I'm looking for claw marks. And there was none of that. But what was weird is that when I got into the thicket, because it had snapped a bunch of fir boughs, and there should have been broken boughs. You could see where they'd been broken off the trees, where this thing had snapped them fresh breaks. But there were zero. I couldn't find any fir boughs on the ground. They were gone. Something had picked them up and taken them away. And the ground was really beat down. It's a lot of fir needles and things where I couldn't make out any tracks. I didn't see any obviously footprints or claw marks in the tree. So that was it. And I just forgot about it after that.
That is an incredible account. Even though there wasn't a visual, that is a wild encounter. Do you think that pizza place is still there?
I still go there, yeah.
Is that Ike's Pizza?
It's Ike's Pizza, yeah.
All right, we can cut that out if you want.
No, that's fine. Ike's Pizza for sure.
Yeah, I have a Google Maps up. The interesting thing I noticed is while you were telling that story, you were talking about how it was like alligators. And the weird thing is that the thing you were describing, that's actually an infrasound thing.
Oh, it is?
If you look it up, like when they use those bellows, that's an infrasound.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no way. Crazy. I didn't know that.
So you combine that.
It hit me.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's weird. Because I heard someone mention it that's what it sounded like to them. And so I went and listened to it, and it's like, whoa, that's exactly what it sounded like. And I don't know what infrasound does, but man, I was frozen. We couldn't move. It was like I walked into an invisible force field and
Exactly.
was frozen in place. It was so weird. I didn't feel sick. I never got nauseous or anything. I just couldn't move. And I was so scared that I was crying. And for no reason, because I don't think, I think that the wave when we froze happened before I even heard anything. I think I was frozen in place before I even started hearing that alligator type sound.
That's wild. That alone is enough for me to hearing. That's enough that you definitely experienced some crazy stuff in the woods that day. No question.
It was bizarre. Yeah, it was weird. So to end this part of the story, so I'd completely forgotten about this event. I was getting ready to graduate high school that next year, and after I graduated high school, I moved to Idaho and became a ski bum for about a decade and spent all that time just in the mountains of Idaho, exploring, skiing, fishing, all times of year, all seasons, and never even thought about Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Didn't cross my mind. In my ski bum career, and it's about 2002, and I'm going to school in Boise, at Boise State University, to get my teaching certificate. And Boise's a really cool city. The river runs right through town, and on the south side of the river, there's the college, and on the north side of the river, there are all these really pretty parks and little concert shells and things. And there's an old zoo, like one of the old school, small town, depressing looking zoos. And so I would have the footbridge to get to the college is right next to the zoo. So I think I'm a junior or something at this point. And I'm cruising on my bike, and it's early in the morning, and I'm riding past the zoo, and I hear these whoops coming from the zoo. And I'm 31 years old, and this event happened to me back when I was 17 years old. And I just instantly froze on my bike and stopped, and was just catapulted back to this event that I just told you about. Like instantly, I could see the color of the rocks. I could see the shadows. Every tiny detail just came flooding back into me when I heard these whoops coming from the zoo. It was really weird. And I had to go to class, and the zoo hadn't opened yet. So I was like, I'm going. Once the zoo opens, I'm going over there and going to ask the zookeeper what the heck makes those noises. So I do. I go, hey, I don't want to go through the zoo. I just want to know. I want to go to your primate area, and will you show me? I heard these really loud whoops this morning. I go, what makes those noises? And he took me to the gibbon cage, and he goes, those are gibbons, and that's what you heard in the morning. And they were making a little bit of whooping sounds, but it was identical, a little higher pitch, and obviously smaller lung capacity, but it was the exact same sound that I'd heard in the forest. It was bizarre. It froze me on my bike. Like I stopped. I was oblivious to whatever was going on around me. I was just transported back to that day in the forest. And up to that point, like I said, never even crossed my mind until I heard those gibbons coming from the zoo.
I'm so glad that you said the little higher pitch, because I personally have heard similar things. And I was just thinking in my mind, I was like, it is very much the same, but it's a little lower. And when you said little higher pitch, I was like, yep, absolutely, 100%.
But the same kind of sound, just a little higher pitch. But it was weird. That sound catapulted me back in time, and every single detail just became so vivid. It was bizarre. I have a terrible memory. I can't remember anything. I don't know what I had for dinner last night, but how in the heck that could happen and everything be so clear, it was really strange.
That's wild. I have a few questions before we leave this part. Did you ever ask your grandma if she had any Bigfoot experiences when you were out there with her?
I don't remember, but she never would have told me anyway. She was pretty sure she wouldn't, because she wouldn't want to scare me from going back in the forest.
Gotcha.
Because it didn't slow me down a bit. I just kept going back out. Yeah, so I never asked.
I share with the Patreon members a little bit about upcoming episodes, and they're really interested to read about what you had sent over. And some of them had some, I'm always like, hey, if you guys have questions for this interviewee, Put them in the comments. So there's a few that are actually related to this part, I believe. Slaya asks, have these events, have they affected your ability to be in the mountains and the woods at all? Or did it not affect you in a way where you're like, I'm never going in the woods again?
It didn't, like I said, I forgot about it. For some reason. It never slowed me down a bit. Like I moved to Idaho and I was out in the woods all the time. No, it never did.
Gotcha.
It never had a negative effect. And even now, I live back in Oregon and we're out all the time. I'm aware and I'm very conscious of that. And I treat the forest a little differently, I think, in terms of how I approach it. You know, I have a lot more gratitude, I guess.
Absolutely. Scott had some questions. They're interesting. So you alluded to how if you grow up in the Pacific Northwest, you know about Bigfoot, right? So his question is, living in the Pacific Northwest, Bigfoot seems to be part of the culture. Were you a believer before your experiences? And you had some really young age experiences.
Yeah, but I never equated that to Bigfoot until I heard someone talk about it on the podcast. Then I was like, whoa, kind of like the bike thing at the zoo. It just triggered this event. So someone mentioned it on their show. I was like, oh, wow, that kind of happened to me. Yeah, I had a hunch it was real. You know, I'd seen the Roger Patterson film. And I think at that point, though, when I was a kid, I felt like there was one of them, and that's where they lived down in California. And we joked. We did a lot of camping, and we were always joking about it, but I don't think anybody took it serious at least at the people I knew and the circle of friends I hung out with. Up until obviously that point, yeah. But you'd hear about it, but it was never, I don't know if we wanted it to be true because it would keep us from going out. Maybe we just tuned it out. We camped in places where I hear about accounts, the Coast Range, all over the place. And aside from these few events that I've had happen to me, for the amount of time I spent out there, these are very few.
There was also an interesting part where you were sharing about the lights coming down into the trees, and you saw those large lights.
So the lights, yeah, that was really weird. There were three of them, and there was one that came down to I guess that would be to the east, but it was maybe at the edge of our property or maybe just past the edge of our property. We had about 13 acres, and it just into the forest. And then there was one that there's a creek that runs through our property, and it comes down the mountain across the road, and one of the lights went down and on the left side, the east side of the drainage, and the other one came down basically right on top of where this encounter happened.
Oh, really?
The next day. Yeah. So the third light was the light came down into basically that, because I Google Earth the distance, and it was 520 yards away as a crow flies. And it was basically just right on top of where it happened. And I never crossed my mind I never connected the two until I started hearing accounts with lights and Sasquatch being related. And I don't know whether or not but I never saw those lights, and I had never really had an encounter like that until, are they connected? I don't know.
That's pretty close to what I think he was getting at, Scott was getting at with his question. Perhaps in relation to lights, would it seem that he may believe that there are maybe paranormal ties, or just a coincidence, or just a lot of questions?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like the word paranormal. I just think it's nature that we don't know about.
Love it. Yeah.
I think it's beyond. I think it just has been happening. I don't know if these two are connected, but it just seemed weird that the light literally went into the forest where this occurred. And again, I never made that connection until I started listening to podcasts. Even that day when it's happening, I'm like, oh, the light came down and now there's something in there. It was the furthest thing from my mind, which is bizarre now that I think back.
And what are the chances that you have this light coming down almost in the same area where you had this encounter, and it's like that, man, it's got to be connected somehow, but we just don't have the knowledge yet.
And that now, having heard enough people being interviewed who have had similar things happen, people are so afraid to just say, duh, I think it's probably connected. How could it not be? Because I've never seen lights before that, and I never had an encounter quite in that spot. It was just too much for coincidence.
Any UFO activity ever in this area?
Not in that area.
Okay. Well, that's pretty fantastic. Feel free to continue. I know, I think we have a few other things to discuss as well.
I've got a couple more, and these are not related to this property on the McKenzie. These are more along the Willamette Pass area, which is from Eugene itself. So you go through Oak Ridge, and you'll end up at Crater Lake, and if you keep going south, you'll end up in Klamath Falls. But when I wasn't up at the McKenzie at my grandma's place, I was out. My dad loved to fly fish, and he got me into fly fishing when I was really young. And he had a spot up right in the town of Oak Ridge where there's an old, I don't know what's there now, but there was a rock quarry in town, and the Willamette River flowed through the bottom of town, and we would fish this rock quarry, and it was really excellent trout fishing. And I was with my dad. I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and we were up fishing the rock quarry, and we caught some fish, and there was a little isolated pool of water up against the hillside that the fish couldn't get out of. So I didn't keep fish, or we didn't eat them. We let them go. We catch and release them. But I was young, and so I put them in this little pool of water and just watched them swim around. I was going to let them go eventually. And my dad's, okay, let's go up and around the corner and fish this riffle. And I'm like, all right. So we leave the fish. There's probably 4 or 5 fish, rainbow trout in this pool. It's probably the size of a little plastic kiddie pool, but there's no way in or out. There's no way for the fish to get out. And it was in the shade. I made sure they were in the shade. The forest came down, and so the fish had some shade, and I was going to let them go when we got back. So we go, we fish, and we come back, and the fish are just completely gone. There's no sign that a bird had come and plucked them or anything. It was just really strange that one minute this little pool's full of fish, and the next minute they're gone. I don't know if that has anything to do with Bigfoot, but it was really weird. And it was up against the hillside, and it was just an odd to come back to. We both looked at each other. Oh, where'd they go? There were no ravens around. There were no, I don't know what could have came and took that many fish. So that's a interesting side note. And then I have one more, and this happened at Murray Lake in 1987. I was a senior in high school, and there were 5 of us, and we were going to go, 3 of us were going to hike. We're going to camp at Murray Lake, and 3 of us were going to hike the south side of Diamond Peak and ski to snowfields up there and come back and camp. And the other 2 guys were going to hang out at the camp and fish. We leave the trailhead, and we're hiking to the lake, and we get maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles into the hike, and we come to so this is all pine trees, and it's high deserty mountains. It's not lush like it is on the McKenzie, where there's ferns and big fir trees and stuff. It's a bit different ecosystem. So we're hiking through this little dry pine forest, and we dip down into this basin that's maybe 3 or 4 acres. And it turns into a totally different ecosystem. There's ferns, there's cedar trees. It's really beautiful. There's a little bog, like a fresh water bog type spring coming out of the ground. It's beautiful. And there's 5 of us, and we're walking in, and we're all thinking the same thing. Oh, wow, we're going to explore this. This is really pretty. And the minute we all got to the crown of the trail where we were going to drop down into this area, this smell just wafted in on us, like, I don't know, like really dead, like skunk cabbage times 10 with, I don't know how to explain, this awful smell came out of nowhere. And we instantly all decided let's just keep going and keep walking. And just for us not to explore something that cool at that age, as a kid, it was bizarre that we all chose to keep going. And then the smell just instantly vanished as we left that spot. So we get to this lake, and we swim, nothing happens. We just camp, everything's normal. So the next morning, 2 of my buddies and I hike Diamond Peak, and we go and we're skiing and we make it back to camp. And there's a note on, they packed up and left. The other two guys split. They were going to fish while we skied. And we got back to camp and they'd left. And there was a note saying mosquitoes were too thick, so we left. See you back in town. But the mosquitoes weren't that bad. It was weird. It's not like them to peel out of here, especially during the day when there's the bugs. There's not real buggy during the day. So we like, oh, whatever. So we camp and nothing happens. And we get back to town the next day. And when we run into our buddies, they're like, hey, it wasn't that buggy. Why did you guys leave? And it took them a second. And they looked at each other funny and said, the truth is, when we were fishing, we kept hearing noises coming out of the forest. We kept hearing sticks breaking and we kept hearing strange grunting noises. And we played it off as a bear at first and thought nothing of it. Thought we'll just go around the other side of the lake and fish. But they said it followed them around the lake. They could hear it pacing him in the forest and was making these weird noises at him. And that's all I got from them. They said, so we got back to camp and just felt really uneasy and decided we'd tell you that it was too buggy, and we split. We got out of there. We were scared. And that's that story.
What year was that around?
That was 19, I wrote it down, the Diamond Peak, 1987.
Okay. Interesting. There is a report on the BFRO from Diamond Peak Wilderness area where 3 hunters were out there. They hear a very loud scream, 30 to 45 seconds. There are reported things from that area, at least one report that's public, but that whole area, from what it sounds like, there's activity all over the place.
Yeah, it is very, what's happened in the last handful of years is forest fires have ravaged some of these places. This, where I'm telling you about, this place on the McKenzie, maybe in 2020, that whole valley got wiped out by forest fire. The hillside that all these things happened to me on is gone now. It's burnt.
Oh, wow.
It's depressing. It's really sad. So, yeah, I don't know. It's coming back a little bit. There's some greenery growing, but the big fir, I don't know how long it's going to be until the fir trees come back. But there's some maples growing and things like that, and some ferns, but they got cooked pretty good. I think that's about all I got. Oh, there's a couple other things if you want to hear about. This happened in 2017 or 2018, I think, somewhere in there. Like I said, I lived in Idaho. I moved to Idaho in 1989 and came back in 2012. And we moved back to Central Oregon, but we still have the property on the McKenzie. I still have it today. I spent a lot of time over there. But so in 2017 or 18, it was around Thanksgiving, and I was out, and this happened a couple nights in a row. It was really bizarre. I'm out in the yard. It gets dark real early, so maybe 5 or 6 in the evening, but it's dark, and it's pouring down rain. It rains a lot over there, and I don't know what I'm outside doing, going to the bathroom or something, and I hear what sounds like up, and it's like I had said, there's a creek that runs through our property, and it drains out on this hillside across the road. And I heard what sounded like a truck brakes screeching down, like they sound like they're wet and screeching down a road. Just this weird metallic grindy sound coming from where there was no roads at all. It was just a ravine with a creek in it, and it was really loud and freaky. It was just like, what in the heck? But it sounded just like metal on metal brakes, and I heard it maybe 2 or 3 nights in a row. And then on that same time frame, maybe a day or 2 later, my neighbor comes over, and he's maybe a couple of 100 yards downriver from me, and he's like, man, I was in my house and I started hearing these owls coming from your property, like huge owls, giant owls coming from your property. So I went outside and I was listening, and I could hear them. They sounded like owls, but it was like they're huge and way too, but they sounded like owls, but they didn't sound like owls, and they were huge. And so I started walking towards your property, and that sound kept going on, but it kept moving away. So the closer I'd get, the further they would move off until it sounded like they were in the forest on the east side of your house, and it just vanished. The noise stopped, which again, at that time, Bigfoot, I had not ever heard of Bigfoot podcast, and I just thought that was weird. Same with the brake screeching thing. But now, knowing what I know because of having listened to these podcasts, it's like, you hear about owls and you hear about these weird sounds. I thought I'd add that to some of the things that I've experienced.
That's some of the weirdest things. And this is back in 2017, you said?
Yeah, 17 or 18, I can't remember.
Okay.
In November.
So you still own that property?
Oh yeah, I'm there all the time.
Oh, okay. And
I'm a school teacher, so I spend my whole summer over there.
Nice. Anything weird sound like that, sound-wise, happen lately, or just the last time was back in 17 or 18?
That was it, yeah. And then, like I said, in 2020, the fires cut through there and took everything out. But I did set up a game cam before, and I wouldn't get anything. I got cougars and bears and deer and turkeys, but that was it. But yeah, it sounded like brakes screeching coming down the creek bed, basically, when there was no road. It was bizarre. And then I had never heard the owls, but my neighbor said it freaked him out. He said you could hear him over his TV 100 yards downriver from me. So he's an older city guy, so he didn't know what to make of it.
I definitely feel like there's some sort of mimicry that's involved. You hear things like what you mentioned. You also hear things like car doors slamming where there's no cars, or rusty gates is one. It's very strange.
Yeah, the rusty metal. That's what it sounded like, rusty metal. And it's bizarre, and it was loud. It was just right across the road from me up on the hill. And there are a couple of logging roads up there, but this was nowhere near one of the roads. It was just coming out of the forest, which, who knows?
You've definitely had some really interesting things happen over your life so far, and thank you so much for sharing with myself and the listeners. And it's amazing you still have that property area up there.
Yeah.
If anything else happens, definitely feel free to reach out.
I will indeed. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate your time, and I love listening to your podcast.
Do you think you might make it down to Oak Ridge this summer coming up?
I'll have to look at my schedule. Yeah, I'd like to. I've never been to one of these before, and my 12-year-old son is heavy into the whole Sasquatch thing, so I might bring him over and check it out, maybe camp or something.
It's going to be a hopping time. If he's into Bigfoot, there's going to be people there that it's the time that they're in Oregon. They probably won't be there again, but man.
I know. We make it over to Cliff's Museum once a year, a little pilgrimage. So we'll go and get a little place in the forest and go squatching and go talk to Cliff a little bit. So that's pretty fun.
How cool is that, man?
Yeah. And those floops I heard, he's got that giant Sasquatch in his museum.
Yep.
And he's got it hooked up, some sound hooked up to it. And that's what those whoops sound exactly like, what he's got going on in our museum.
Murphy the Sasquatch. Love it.
Yeah.
I got to get over there myself one day for sure. But
it's cool. Yeah. He keeps adding to it. So we keep going back.
Absolutely. Brad, thank you so much for hanging out. And I hope to maybe hear from you again someday in the future.
Indeed, Jeremiah. Thank you so much.
Just want to take a few minutes to say thank you to you, all my listeners, for listening to the podcast. Please take a minute to help out the show by subscribing on YouTube, making sure you hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications, and share the episode on YouTube with a friend. Also, if you're listening to us on a podcast, thank you so much. Make sure that you're subscribed, share the show with a friend. Really, it's all about sharing the show wherever you can. If you've had a Bigfoot encounter related to the following or know someone who has, please reach out to me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com or pass on my email. Here's a list. The Subtle Lake area of Oregon, Rainbow, Oregon, McKenzie Bridge area, Sweet Home, pretty much that entire area, the north part, if you get what I mean. I'll see you back next time, listeners. Sasquatch Summerfest this year, July 11th through the 12th. It's going to be fantastic. July 11th through 12th in Green Waters Park in Oak Ridge, Oregon. And listeners, if you're going to go, you can get a 2-day ticket for the cost of one if you use the code BFS, like Bigfoot Society, but BFS, and it'll get you some off your cost. Priscilla was nice enough to provide that for my listeners. So there you go. I look forward to seeing you there. So make sure you head over to www.sasquatchsummerfest.com and pick up your tickets today.